Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Roots, a place where we gather in community to talk about mental health so we can travel the journey of life together. I'm Samuel Richards.
I'm Julie Richards.
And today we are off the path with Patty McClarren. Welcome, Patty.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have different people from all over, and I'm excited to have another Ohioan on the podcast. I love, quick shout out to our Ohio listeners, because every time we post an episode, suddenly we have like 60 straight downloads right from Ohio. So
Ooh, nice.
it's good to have another home kid. So yeah,
Go
Patty,
Buckeyes. Can we say that or no?
I think so, without our legal team getting too upset. Anyway, Patty, thanks so much for being on the show. How about you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. I'm Patty McClarren. I'm a licensed therapist in the states of Ohio and Minnesota. I work primarily with people who have developmental and relational trauma, and primarily with adoptees and their families. And I'm myself an adoptee back from many, many years ago. I'm 53 years old, and I grew up in Columbus, and now I live in Cincinnati.
What's the connection there on Minnesota? I don't think I ever knew that about you.
Yes. Well, I had a client that moved to Minnesota.
Oh,
and
okay.
She asked me if I would figure it out, and it wasn't that difficult to get licensed. So
nice.
Now I have quite a few clients in Minnesota.
Oh my goodness, isn't that interesting?
Yeah. I'm working on my Kentucky license for the same reason.
Wow,
you can keep me informed on how to do all this. That's good.
Well, I think partly because I have this specialty, people are seeking out. I think I am kind of the unicorn that I'm in fact an adoptee who works with adoptees. And there's a lot of us out there, but it's
sometimes hard to find.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well,
it's a privilege.
Yeah. I'm so excited, Patty, to have you on our Off the Beaten Path today. And for our listeners, Patty and I have done some different trainings together that we just started talking and hit off a great friendship and connection. And so it is fun for me to have colleagues that I really value and trust, and we can mutually support each other in mental health and supporting our clients. So it is super exciting to have you with us today. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you, Julie. I really value your friendship. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, nice. Yeah.
I think that perspective, being an adoptee and a therapist who helps other adoptees, is super interesting. Often I talk about on our before the show that Mom is a therapist who specializes with adoptees and stuff. So that perspective you bring is so interesting. I was curious if you could tell us a little bit about how being an adoptee influences you being a therapist, and kind of how your mindset, what your mindset is like in those instances.
It's a really good question. I think I think many therapists are adoption competent. I don't want to say all adoptees should see adoptees. I think what I can bring is that knowing of how it feels to feel different and not reflected in my family, that I grew up with, and that isolation and that wanting for mirrors and that feeling of abandonment and waiting for it to happen again. And I think that is a lifelong journey for adoptees. And I think during sessions, I don't say things like, oh yeah, I get it, I'm an adoptee, not at all. I think a lot of it goes unsaid. I think adoptees come to me and so much is unsaid. They don't have to explain the adoption is trauma. And there are therapists out there that aren't adoptee competent, and in which case, I've had clients say they've said to their therapist, but what about my adoption? Do you think that affects me? And they'll say, well, when were you adopted? As an infant? Well, that was a long time ago. And it's just very invalidating. So, but again, I do think you can be adoptee competent without being an adoptee.
And I have heard just the invalidation as well, that, well, you're in a loving family now, as if you should be quote unquote over it or something, that it isn't trauma if you have a loving family now, which is also horribly invalidating, and not understanding the nature of neuroscience, trauma, or adoption.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think that's so important. What I've found, as an adoption therapist myself, I'm an adoptive parent, and that gives me a window into the triad, but also
Mhm.
learning from adoptees and hearing, whether it's webinars or podcasts or trainings or books or things, just listening to the adoptee voice is so important. And to be able to consider um, the diversity of people's unique experiences and to allow them to have their experience. And that is just all really fundamental and important in trying to help people heal.
Hey, Mom. I was curious. You said the triad. What is that?
Yeah, so we talk about the birth mother, the adoptee, and the adoptive
Hmm.
family. So there's the side of being the original parent has a lot of trauma and challenge to heal and work through as well. And then for the adoptee, some are in reunification and some are not. And so there's layers to that, which Patty, of course, you can speak to this as well if you want to add to what I've said.
Well, I think some people in the adoption community have gone away from the word triad
Hmm.
and we're using the word constellation.
Cool.
There's so many people involved in where I am today. So there was, my first mother. There was the people who at the infant asylum. So back in the day, I spent some time in an infant asylum, which I think is an orphanage, and then I spent time in foster care, and then I have my parents, and then some of us have special relationships with all kinds of other people. So we're going to adoption constellation is kind of one of the words out there.
I like that
And a
better.
lot of us aren't using birth mother anymore. And it's kind of we're on the fence. It's an interesting time in adoption land. A lot of us aren't saying birth mother because that's kind of saying like relegating her to just someone who gave birth to you. That's it. Kind of like using her for that. And that's not how we want to look at this person. She was your first mother. You spent, 7, 8, 9 months with her. You have her genes. She was your first mother, is what some people are saying. I'm comfortable with whatever anyone wants to use. If you want to say birth mother, if you want to say adoption triad, like I think we have to get curious with people that are involved, and whatever words they want to use, that's what we need to use.
Absolutely.
But
And I'm glad you're
it's
educating me. I appreciate that because I don't think I've heard about constellation yet, but that makes so much sense because like you said, in your story, you've had your first family, you've had an orphanage, you've had foster families. There's so many people that's a broader scope than just a triad.
Yeah.
It also seems less lonely, for sure.
Oh, that's nice. A constellation.
Yeah, I see like a group of like 20 stars instead of a group of just, 3.
That is nice. Good point.
Earlier, Patty, you said that there are a lot of things that went unsaid with you and your like adoptee clients. I was just thinking about that. Like it's a thought that hasn't left my mind, and I was curious, like, what are some of those, unsaid thoughts or those that kind of assumptions that you both can say, okay, we're in an understanding about this.
Well, I think we're in understanding that separation is trauma, and maybe everybody feels this way. But I can say when I'm sitting with a client who's been adopted, we understand that separation is trauma. And if I have a client that says, my boyfriend was walking out the door and he was just going down the street to get some yogurt, but I was sure he was leaving me forever. And it's like, and you could say, well, that's anxious attachment or disorganized attachment, but she can look at me and say, what an adoptee thing to think. It's like, a lot of us are still waiting for that second ball to drop. We can present as avoidant and we don't want to talk about being adopted and, oh, this didn't affect me, or we can present as really anxious. But deep down inside, a lot of us, we're told we're adopted because we're special. You were chosen, you were special. And you're like, well, if my birth mother thought I was special or chosen, then why'd she leave me? So if she left me, my first mother, then you're going to leave me too. What's to stop you from leaving me?
Mm-hmm.
So not all adoptees feel this way. I can just speak for myself, really.
Mm-hmm. I've heard some discussion recently as well with the term forever family that is very conflicting as far as similar to what you just said. So if my adoptive family is my forever family, what does that mean about my first family, and what's the distinction that you will stay any more than my first family stayed? And not to mention, I've heard so many people, adoptees and not, who the concept of forever is daunting and scary and overwhelming and
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily a peaceful word even to use. That just to understand the complexity of human language and meaning that we put behind things, that to be able to hear maybe why we don't want to oversimplify with words, to say forever family from an adoptive perspective would be to validate that we're here, we're not leaving, but it can stir so much. But what if? Or is that a guarantee anything more than what my first family was? And it doesn't quite acknowledge the whole story. Similar to adoption. Adoption, from an adoptive parent standpoint, what I often hear is, that the adoptee is a gift and a blessing and um, it's a very positive. We are so thankful to be adoptive parents, but it doesn't take into account relinquishment and abandonment and loss and grief and pain and trauma. And I imagine there's so much that's stirred up for an adoptee as so I'm here to serve a function for you, that you didn't have something and I'm supposed to fill that need. And it can just, I would imagine, get very tangled up with lots of meaning.
Oh,
Can you
sure.
speak to any of that?
Yeah,
Um,
I think what we need to tell our kids who are adopted is I have a hard time with, we chose you, you're special. Even it's a blessing is, I don't know. I have a hard time with that. I think kids need to hear adoption is a decision the adults made. Because what if I stop being special?
mm,
What if
mhm,
I push the boundaries and I start behaving badly? Am I no longer special and a blessing?
mhm,
So I think kids need to know adoption is a decision the adults made, and we are a family and we love you. And that's it. Like, I think anything else, and maybe not all kids pick this up, but so many kids are, people pleasers when they're adopted, even more so than your maybe non-adopted kid. And then so many adoptees are otherwise known as the angry adoptee, pushing all the boundaries. Well, they're both hurting on the inside.
mhm,
And the second kid is just trying to see, how far can I push it until you let me go, until you do what the first mother did.
mhm.
And so we just need to sit with them and say, we're a family, we made this decision. And I think that's what kids need to hear, personally. I think it's sacred work to talk to your kids. And I think the more you can get curious with your adopted kids, get curious about them. What is their internal life? What are they thinking?
And
I think it's
in
important.
that, as an adoptive parent, to not be defensive or easily hurt or wounded by
Oh,
the enormity of the adoptee's experience. So even if they have incredible questions of, where do I belong? And do I even want to be in this adoptive family? And do I even fit here? And where do I belong with any family or with any relationship, or just all the depth of complexity and sometimes pain or confusion or all the layers to that. I
Mhm.
think it's important for the adoptive parents to stay in a place of um, open receptivity and willingness to just be a safe place for healing to happen. And that's hard to do. I know that's hard to
Oh, I
do from
bet.
hearing adoptive parents
Yeah.
sharing their struggles and pains. And because sometimes, and even what you alluded to a little bit, Patty, was like the acting in or acting out. They're either internalizing and becoming the perfectionist so that they won't be rejected or they'll be wanted or they'll be liked and being a people pleaser, or they are working through all the conflicted feelings and angry or hurt or overwhelmed or confused or traumatized and acting out. And I would imagine a third category would be somewhere in between the two and doing some of both, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Mhm.
Mm.
For sure. I think that's why we ask parents if they're looking to adopt to do their own work, first. If
Mhm.
you can be a regulated, connected parent, as you're going to be able to let this be your kids' experience. You'll be able to fulfill their needs. If you're asking a baby to fulfill any needs you have, you're starting behind the start line. Like you need to decide, as adults do, make this decision. I'm going to adopt this child to fulfill this child's needs, through their lifespan. Our children aren't here, and I'm a parent of 3 adult children. Our children aren't here to fulfill our needs.
Right.
They're just not. We are here to fulfill their needs. And I think sometimes if we meaning adopt parents, haven't done our grief work, haven't really put time into grieving our infertility, if that's what brought us here, or whatever we might be grieving before we adopt, it's just putting you behind the start line. Yeah, our children are here. We're here to support them. And that's what the relationship needs to be. And that's in all families.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
That's my thought.
I'm really glad that you're saying that, because I think, for some it's infertility that brings them to adoption. For others, in Christian circles, they'll say God called us to adopt, which
Mhm.
is um, very valid for those who that's part of their spiritual journey. However, that adds all kinds of layers of challenge to the adoptee as well. Like, what kind of God is this that allows my world to be shattered? And I don't know if I really want that God. I don't know if I like any of this God that you're telling me about, or expecting that I will fall into line to believe what you do, which I've found with a handful of adolescent adoptees that I work with. Is, just because the parents have a relationship with God does not assume that the adolescents do as well. And so there's conflict in that. And um, I think there's something to be said for an honest desire. I do think it's possible that people are altruistic and wanting to help and give,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that can also be sticky, where it's also meeting a need of ours if we are helping someone, because then we feel valuable and we feel, we're doing something that has meaning and that's important. It's not to say that it's wrong to have that motive, but to be able to name it and to say, well, this is what I'm hoping in this, is that I can help someone else and be a part of a healing journey without sliding too far into I'm a rescuer and
Yes.
I'm doing something because you need me to rescue you. It's much more of, we're humans, we all struggle.
Mhm.
I'm learning how to heal and grow, and I want to be a support to my child to help them heal and grow. Not that that relationship is going to fulfill my sense of belonging in the world or purpose and meaning. It all gets very tangled and muddied when you start to look at it, because it's like, okay, whose need is being met? What is the purpose? And there's a lot of layers and all that. I don't know if that's making some sense. What does that stir up for you, Samuel, as you're hearing us kind of talking about that? I'd be curious.
Well, that last line definitely brings up the boundaries that we've talked about before, and how when things are confused and muddled, there aren't clear boundaries. I'd be interested to hear what Patty thinks. I think, well, maybe I'll hear what Patty thinks, and maybe I can ask you a double question too, to kind of, because we've talked about on this series before, even if everybody has food, water, shelter, what they need to survive, some natural disasters or accidents like adoption is something that is almost unavoidable, in just how the way the world works in terms of like loss and end and stuff. So, or maybe it doesn't, my point is just like, is there a sustainable way to do adoption? Is there a way that it is, ethical and something of strength? I do know it takes a lot of work for sure, but I was curious, like, what does that look like? What does a healthy adoption look like? What does a sustainable adoption look like, as opposed to, something that's all about the parent, or, some of the other things we've been talking about?
Like, what would help it be a healthy system? And I mean, there's definite need for adoption. There's sometimes need for foster care or these different systems. And yet, in talking with people, sometimes the system is very broken and inherently not helpful, or potentially, talking with those who have been in foster families that have been abusive to them and have added more trauma. I think that's a good question, Samuel. Like, what are your thoughts on that, Patty, as far as what would a healthy system look like? How do we help support that? How do we grow towards that?
Well, I think this may not answer your question, but I think it starts with getting curious about the system that you so perfectly said is broken. And it is broken. If you can, think about any system that bothers you, a social system in any country. If you're like, social justice, and you can say to yourself, well, you can see it so clearly that it needs help. I think the adoption system is just as clearly needs help. We give a lot of resources to a lot of people to take care of these children, and it's possible, if we could use some of those resources for their first families. I mean, it's not popular, but there's a saying, we're giving a lot of resources. Instead of giving the resources to the people with children, we're giving children to people with resources. Now, there's no perfect fix. There's no, in a perfect world, none of this would be needed, but there's no good fix.
I am curious. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I agree with you for sure. I am curious in like situations that, natural disasters are something that can definitely happen, or a car accident where suddenly you have an infant who doesn't have a home. I'm curious, like, what are those pieces that are needed? I think that's such a good insight, though. Like, we're giving kids to people with resources instead of vice versa.
Yeah, that was profound. I've never quite heard that worded that way, and I felt chills just shoot down my leg. I was just like, whoa. I almost wanted to say that again, Patty. Like, we need to sit with that.
Yeah, I think if you're an adoptive parent and you can do your work on your grief as to what brought you to adoption, and I guess, like Julie, you mentioned there are different kinds of adoptive parents. If you can just do your work and make yourself a more connected person, and not need to be propped up with that kind of savior complex, if you can feel grounded and present, and you've got energy, because you're a child. If you adopt, this child will be traumatized. You know, the relinquishment is the trauma. You know, there are adoptees my age who've had wonderful adoptive families, no additional trauma, but they still hold trauma. So it's not, you know, back in the day, you know, my mom and dad, who wonderful people, they have since passed. They were told back in the day, here's your clean slate baby. You know, just treat this baby as it was your own. There's no difference between this baby and a biological baby. And I know we've come a long way with that. But what would be great is if we could, you know, get curious and maybe parent a little differently. Maybe, you know, just know that your child is going to have kind of special needs just by being relinquished. And I think there's a lot of good thinking out there and a lot of people who are trying. And there's some really wonderful adopted families out there.
And how do you conceptualize for your clients, for yourself, or for others about what that trauma is doing with the brain? What's the neuroscience of this relinquishment?
Well, I think, as you know, when we're born, what is it? Only the right side of the brain is on. No, the left side of the brain is on, but trauma's in the right side. So we can't communicate. So often when I work with adoptees, even little ones, and they're acting out and they're behaving badly, and you ask them what's wrong, and they're like, I don't know what's wrong. And it's because they haven't been able to communicate, like this trauma that's in their brainstem. They can't communicate what's wrong. They really don't know. A lot of us can say, oh, I'm anxious because I was in a car wreck 10 years ago, and every time I hear a loud noise, I'm anxious. You know, often people with early pre-verbal trauma, you know, they're not able to say what's wrong.
It's before words.
It's before words, yeah.
And just that sense of, I mean, I love the neuroscience and the like interpersonal neurobiology. When we had Robin Goebel on the podcast, the idea that we need relationship, we need to be mirrored, we need attachment. And so when that's ripped away and lost, it is a crisis. I'm being annihilated. I'm being removed from the very thing that is supposed to be helping me live, thrive, and survive in this world. And so there's fear, there's pain, there's all kinds of impact on the cortisol and the stress hormones and the inflammation and everything that's happening from a physiological standpoint in our bodies, that it has to try to resolve and settle and calm the nervous system, which happens through attachment, through safety, through co-regulation. But when your relationships as an infant, toddler, young child, adolescent, when those relationships that were meant to keep you safe are also bumpy and disruptive and not the support that you need, it just perpetuates more dysregulated nervous system. So I'm just trying to help our listeners who might not have heard of adoption being trauma or relinquishment being trauma. I know the Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier talks about that the cries of the newborn in the hospital are distinguished if they are a baby that is staying with their birth family or first family, or if they are being relinquished at that point. The cries are even different. It's like they just know in their felt experience that this is not how it was meant to be.
And we know from psychology that when a baby's born, the baby believes he's at one with his mother. He doesn't realize they're two different beings, right? That doesn't happen until they start saying no, you know, when they're about 2 years old, and they can say no because they realize they're two different beings. So if you think when you're born that you're at one with this half of you that left, it's like a death. You know, it feels like death. These babies are just waiting for that other half of themselves to come back. So if you have a adopt a child who says, you know, I'm not really interested in talking about it, I think a lot of it could be they don't feel safe. I really do. And you can be the most wonderful parent in the world, but If for some reason, I mean, there's just this little part of many adoptees, not all, but many, that just don't feel safe saying, yeah, I am curious about my biological family. So one way you could do it is when they're little, you can, if you tell them you have the most beautiful brown eyes, and the little child says, I don't know what, but then you can say, I wonder where you got those brown eyes from. Or do you ever wonder? Because I'm curious. Did your mom have brown eyes? Did your dad have brown eyes? Like, I'm curious. And it's not a leading statement. A leading statement would be, do you ever wonder where you get your brown eyes? It would be more of a loving statement. See, I'm kind of curious, and see if that develops into a conversation. These kids need safe opportunities to be able to explore their identity and explore their feelings to make it more integrated, right? So they're not so anxious, and to kind of feel more co-regulated when they can talk about, and they need them throughout, different developmental stages. I would love to see a parent say, well, let's draw a picture of what we think your birth mother might look like, or if a child is naturally gifted at something, wouldn't that be a great opportunity to say, do you ever wonder, I kind of wonder, So a lot of times parents will say to their kids, are you interested in meeting your biological parents? And let me tell you, most adoptees, well, it depends which side they're on. They might be like, yes, because I hate you. But then many of us are more like, oh, no, mom, no, like you're my mom and I don't want anything to do with that, because that's kind of a fear stance. But if your adoptive mother said to you, what if your biological mother was outside that door right now? Would you want to meet her?
Wow.
That's a whole different question, right? What if she was out there? And I can't create her to be out there right now. But what if she was out that door? Then would you want to meet her? And I bet you those kids would all say, heck yeah. Like, or, some form of at least open to the conversation. We need to know as adoptees that our adoptive parents are comfortable with us being interested, right? We need to know you're comfortable, even if it's hard, but this is what you signed up for. So adoptive kids need to know that their parents are comfortable with the fact, and it's just a fact because these are decisions, adults made, that you have two sets of parents out there. There's a second set that you haven't met, or maybe in an open adoption you have met. But the more comfortable the adoptive parent can be with this information, the more comfortable the child will be. I think it's important.
Because then the child doesn't have to meet the needs of the parent to be comfortable. I mean, so often, I've heard adoptees saying, it's never about me. It never gets to be about me. It's always about me trying to help everybody else feel okay and not too awkward. If you're talking about transracial adoptees, it's even more layered and complex because someone who is a person of color who's raised in a white family, for instance, doesn't have the racial mirrors of someone who has the same ethnicity and cultural background. There's more layers in that. I mean, it's just a lot to have to process and make sense of. And if the adoptive parent is particularly threatened or shaken or insecure or unable to just hold the space of whatever they need to experience at whatever point in the journey, it does a disservice to the adoptee who's needing to heal such deep, profound places. Can you speak just for a moment, Patty, to the healing that happens across the lifespan? That there may be, I work with some adoptive parents who their adoptee is 8, something, somewhere in the less than 10 range. And then some that are adolescents, some in their 20s and their 30s. So I've seen in my practice adoptees at every age and development across the lifespan. But can you speak from the perspective of an adoptee, how you kind of conceptualize how that might change or develop over time?
Sure, that's a good question. I think we can preface it with, if we are considering that relinquishment is trauma, one evidence is that the rate of completed suicides for adoptees is 4 times that of the rate of completed suicide for people who are not adopted. So that helps someone realize, okay, maybe relinquishment is trauma. That's a great starting point. Um, but as far as healing over lifespan, I think self-compassion is so important because we all get kind of gaslighted, and so like if I look at my mom and dad, they were gaslighted because they were told I was just going to be any old baby. And Lord, I wasn't. I was not easy child. And boy, they didn't know what to do with me. I was like a foreign object, so they were gaslighted. And I can be gaslighted if everyone's telling me, well, at least Patty, you had a really good family, and at least you had food on the table, and at least your parents loved you. It's like, that's kind of gaslighting, because yes, those things are true, but like it still hurts. I'm still hold grief in my heart. But I think with self-compassion is the greatest gift we can give ourselves as adoptees. I think the more records are being open, birth records, so people are finding, there's a lot of communities out there. There's a lot of communities of adoptees supporting each other. And that's a great way to help people heal over the lifespan. But I think the more firm parents can be if adoptive parents can know that love is not enough, there's love and there's work to be done. If you can be secure in who you are and kind of let your kid push all the boundaries, and that kid can feel that you still aren't leaving. You're not leaving, Back in the day, our parents were told, well, just tell him you'll take him back to the orphanage. Like, not good advice.
Oh, gosh.
If you behave poorly. So anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but adoption's lifelong. And I think most of us, many of us at least, are going to hold grief in our hearts our whole lives. So it's just something, aren't we all, isn't everyone carrying something heavy? Back to the humanity of it all. Like, we're all carrying something heavy.
And I think I've heard it said that sometimes even suicide ideation might be in the room across the lifespan as well. That and what a hard thing that is to wrap our minds around, because the rate of suicide is 4 times higher. And yet sometimes, if we can understand the depth of pain, sometimes that's a way of wording it, is that I don't know what to do with this level of pain or grief or trauma. And so learning how to even live, if that's going to be a companion along the journey, if that house visitor of suicide ideation is going to be with me, that it's not something that I necessarily will have completely resolved, or it might not go away. What do I do with that now? But I think being able to put words to it and be able to, like you mentioned, have the self-compassion, have the sense of, okay, so this is a part of me. How can I befriend that part? How can I have more support when I notice that friend just walked in the room that I don't want to stuff or avoid or deny or act on, from a safety standpoint? Obviously, we want to be very alert to safety concerns. But sometimes for folks, that's the language of my pain. And it might not ever go away. It might shift and change and get lighter and develop, and you gain more skills and you gain more connection or relationship, but there might still be that vulnerability, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know the rate of ideation for adoptees. I don't know if there's been studies on that. I've never suffered from it, but I sure do know a lot of people who have. And I don't know the difference. I don't know why that didn't come to me. That doesn't meet me. And it does so many of my friends and colleagues and clients. But I do think, like you said, putting words to it helps too. If it's all messed up in my heart somewhere and it's confusing, if I can take it out and kind of organize it and set it next to me and look at it and say, yeah, that really sucks. Like that was really difficult, and it's still difficult to think about it. But if it's sitting next to me instead of in me, I think it's a little easier.
and having someone to be an empathic witness to it so that you're not alone in it, with the idea of trauma being afraid and being alone, and
Yeah.
being able to have somebody that we can connect to and find safety in.
Yeah. Everybody needs that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Adoption is certainly not the only trauma out there.
Hmm.
Let me see if there's anything I missed. I did have some
Yeah.
notes.
Anything else that you wanted to
Sure.
say? We don't have to end on an extremely serious, deep note. I didn't want to necessarily end it that way, but I've heard that and I've seen that, and I just wanted to put some language to it in case there's somebody out there
Mm-hmm.
that is saying, what do we do with that? I mean, how do they not become the statistic that is 1 in 4 when that is their lifelong visitor?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think grief, if it's grief, doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be held.
Mm-hmm.
And that's such a simple way of looking at it. But I don't think grief can be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it needs to be held. If someone could look into your heart and hold that with you, changes a lot.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a part of a continuing discussion. The last couple episodes that we have had are actually all around adoptive relationships, about the experience and about, the psychology and mindset behind that. So if this episode hit you in a certain way, or if you're an adoptee or an adoptive family or know an adoptee, or if you're just a human, definitely check out those episodes. And Patty, where can people find you if they were looking for you?
My website is CincinnatiRidgeCounseling.com.
Perfect. CincinnatiRidgeCounseling.com. There'll be a link in the show notes if you want to visit that. Maybe you can be her first Kentucky client. But anyway, so every episode we end with some gratitude or affirmation. And so I just wanted to open up the floor to see if anybody wanted to share.
I'll share. I'm really grateful that you are both curious about the adoptee experience. I think curiosity is a cure for so many things. And I'm just really grateful for that today.
I am so thankful for adoption, adoptees, this topic, the conversation around it. I have learned so much when we started into our adoption journey. That was, I guess, over 17 years ago now. And I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue at all. And I am just so thankful for the continuing process of learning and growing and listening and understanding. And I imagine as long as I'm on this earth, there'll be much more to keep learning and listening and understanding. So I'm just thankful for the opportunity that we have, if we're willing, to be on that path of growth and the complexity of humanity. It's funny, some people are afraid of it or box things in, and blow the lid off the box and be willing to explore just how incredible humanity and the depth and the layers are. Messy and hard, and they are work. I liked how you said that it takes more than just love. It takes work. That was a beautiful way of understanding it, and I think applicable to everyone in their relationships. So yeah, I feel my heart is definitely grateful for this discussion, for Patty, for you being here with us, and for Samuel and his work with the podcast. I know we've had a little bit of a break there for a while, so I'm glad to be back on, and I'm glad that we can reconnect. So I'm grateful for that too.
Yeah, me too. I think I'm going to copy your affirmation as well. More of just because when we started this series arc, I was taking a foster care class, and so starting to learn sort of the mindset of what they were talking about, and then every one of these episodes takes twice as long as it does to edit than it does to listen. So I've learned a lot also through the conversations, with Robin or our regularly scheduled community roots, and sitting here with Patty today for sure. I've written down a couple of lines as well that I might throw in our summary. But Yeah, I mean, this is something that we often don't talk about, and I also think it's applicable to everyone. That isn't just limited to adoptees. Often this mindset, I think this is how we should be treating people anyway, regardless of whether they're adopted or not. And I think it's just more pronounced in adoptees. Like, it's more apparent that the language needs to change or the mindset needs to change. And so I'm really appreciative of what I've learned, and excited that there are fighters out there who are advocating for the right stuff. So cool. That's my affirmation, I guess, / thank you to the world. Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Patty, for being on the show with us today. It was an absolute treat. And everyone, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Okay. Thanks so much for joining us.